Thank you for joining us for the second of two rebuttals in our debate entitled, Israel Only, Is It Scripturally Defendable? This has been an interesting debate, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to engage Mr. Miano in such an important topic. While it's true that notable preterists such as Don K. Preston, William Bell, Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, Ed Stevens, Larry Siegel, Charles Meek, and others have not engaged in a moderated public debate about I.O. as Mr. Miano has, the excuse Mr. Miano offers in defense of their silence is quite interesting. He says, quote, "Many have, in their estimation, dealt with I.O. and simply feel as though this is a dead issue being brought up to continue controversy," unquote. So, while preterists continue to debate with futurists about what should by now be a dead issue, futurism, the only view in over 1,000 years that could kill Christianity forever is avoided like the plague by the who's who of preterists who incidentally haven't sought a public debate on it because it's a dead issue? I think people are not so naive as to believe such a thing. I can assure you, Israel only is an issue they will have to confront sooner or later. Regarding Mr. Miano's rebuttal, he can't have it both ways. He refers to Larry Siegel's article on the so-called mystery that was being made known, and just assumes that because the gathering of Israel was known by Old Testament prophets, that the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret must be referring to foreigners coming into the kingdom. But Mr. Miano's assumption that the mystery must pertain to foreigners of Israel is not just unfounded, it's another big blunder. This one I call Miano's massive mistake. In his opening statement, Mr. Miano erroneously quoted Isaiah 14:2 and Isaiah 49:6 in an attempt to show how people outside of Old Covenant Israel were prophesied to be included in a post-AD 70 kingdom, a 500-year error. However, Ephesians 3 verse 9 says the mystery was hidden for the ages from Old Testament prophets. If foreigners to Israel being in the kingdom were the mystery that was unknown by Old Testament prophets, then Ephesians 3 verse 9 clearly debunks all the Old Testament passages Mr. Miano has used thus far in the debate to try to show people outside of Old Covenant Israel were predicted to be in the kingdom. I'd like to thank Larry Siegel for his article, which has helped to show that Mr. Miano's use of Old Testament passages is self-refuting. I agree, though, that foreigners were being brought into the kingdom. Some of them were the Gentile elect diaspora, descendants of the tribes of Israel, whom Paul was speaking to in his letter to the Ephesians, people considered by Jews to be foreigners, according to Ephesians 2, verse 19 in the King James Version. Predictably, the focus was always on Israel only. Remember, either the fullness of the Gentiles came in just prior to the end, and there are no more Gentiles to preach the gospel to, which is the consistent preterist position, or the Gentiles are still coming in today, and the end has not yet come, which is the futurist position. Consistency is key. Turning to his first rebuttal, Mr. Miano mentioned Jeremiah 23 verses 3 through 4, chapter 30 verses 18 through 20, Ezekiel 36 verses 10 through 12, chapter 36 verses 34 through 36, chapter 37 verses 27 through 28, hoping they would affirm his idea of post-AD 70 continuationism. Apparently, Mr. Miano is unaware that these verses pertain to a time of over 500 years before the end of the age. He's making the same blunder he made in his opening post with Isaiah 49 verse 6, isolating a verse from its historical context and imposing a later first century application upon it. The wider context of Jeremiah 23 pertains to Israel returning from captivity to a literal land, rebuilding literal cities, and making desolate places inhabitable again to live in their own land. Jeremiah 30 pertains to the comfort and security of, quote, my people, unquote, Israel and Judah, once they had returned to their land after years of exile. In verse 18, we see a prediction of how the city would be rebuilt, clearly putting Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 3 through 18 as a pre-Second Temple era text. Ezekiel 36 pertains to the Second Temple era, not beyond it. It's describing the restoration of the people, including their population increase. Verse 29 says, quote, and I will deliver you from all your uncleanliness, and I will summon the grain and make it abundant and lay no famine upon you, unquote. That's from Ezekiel 36, verse 29. This simply does not work for Mr. Miano. In AD 70, Jewish factions led by John of Giscala, Simon Gioria, and Eleazar ended up destroying the grain and other food reserves that were in the city's storehouses. Hardly a picture of the beginning of a glorious new age of a continuing kingdom. A famine was foretold by Agabus in Acts 11, verse 28, which is mentioned by historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Eusebius, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, and was so severe in Jerusalem, Josephus says, that many people perished for lack of food. Brown, Priestley, and Levi's History of the Destruction of the City and Temple of Jerusalem and of the Ruin and Dispersion of the Jewish Nation, page 10, says, pertaining to these famines, quote, the putrid effluvia, which arose from the unburied dead and from the prevalence of famine. History bears testimony that earthquakes, famines, and pestilence had never been more frequent nor more remarkable than they were in those times. These Old Testament verses Mr. Miano is citing have to do with a restoration long before the end of the age, not after. He seems to think that isolating a few verses from their surrounding historical context will make them mean the end of the age kingdom will continue to grow on earth. But as we just saw, he couldn't have applied these verses more improperly if he tried. Returning to his first rebuttal, Mr. Miano says, quote, I have hardly desired to prolong Israel's redemptive narrative long after it ended, or to entertain role-playing from a 16th century worldview, unquote. But he prolongs Israel's redemptive narrative when he believes and teaches things like, quote, I am saved from darkness, sin, idolatry, and wickedness due to the propitiating work of Jesus Christ, unquote. All of which have elements of Israel's redemptive narrative, for example, sin, salvation, and propitiation. As I pointed out in my first rebuttal, Jesus didn't come to save mankind from darkness, what Mr. Miano considers a lack of knowledge about God, but from the curse of the law, Galatians 4 verse 5, among others. Only Israel had and was under the curse of the law, Deuteronomy 4 verse 8, Psalm 147, 19 through 20. And recall that in his opening statement, Mr. Miano said, I am in total agreement that the death of being under law, sin, and death was Israel's identity only, and it is a misnomer to apply that to nations outside the 12 tribes. By his own criteria, his view of sin is a misnomer. Likewise, Mr. Miano thinks he's saved from sin, but the biblical narrative shows Jesus' work of salvation from sin was directed to his people, Israel, Matthew 1 verse 21, among others, and that sin was brought to an end, Daniel 9 verse 24. No foreigners mentioned or implied. Mr. Miano then applies the propitiating work of Christ to himself, but all 4 times the word propitiation is used in the Bible, it's associated with descendants of Israel. No foreigners mentioned or implied. Since the law passed away in AD 70, and sin is not imputed to anyone today, whatever sin Mr. Miano thinks he is saved from must be part of some other redemptive narrative, not the biblical redemptive narrative. Still role-playing from John Calvin's 16th century worldview, Mr. Miano says, quote, "I believe in the sovereignty and foreknowledge of God over those whom he chooses as his elect," unquote. He then leaps to John Calvin's defense. He says, quote, "I.O. is simply the lazy man's effort at trying to systematize the details, all the while daring to mock John Calvin's effort of doing so," unquote. I disagree. I believe I.O. is being shown to be a rigorous and consistent application of audience relevance that people like John Calvin missed. Notably, this is the same John Calvin who consented to the execution of Michael Servetus, a man who denied the Trinity and infant baptism. Servetus burned for 1 hour simply because of his theological views. It's the same John Calvin who believed that God did not create all humans on equal terms, but created some individuals for eternal damnation, a doctrine known as double predestination. The emotional pain and self-loathing millions have endured on account of Augustine and John Calvin's false doctrines is nearly incomprehensible. Yet Mr. Miano continues in his affection for their doctrines, which are centuries removed from a Hebrew interpretive paradigm. His commitment to their error can be seen in his church's doctrinal statement. For example, quote, "Nothing prevents the salvation of the greatest sinner on earth but his own inherent depravity." Clearly, Mr. Miano is committed to upholding the doctrine of total depravity, which has its origination in the twisted mind of a 4th century Manichaean Gnostic, Augustine. Total depravity conveniently involves all men, not just Israel. Mr. Miano hopes that if I.O. can be defeated, his commitment to Reformed doctrines will be affirmed. Again, from his church's doctrinal statement, quote, "That election is the eternal purpose of God, according to which he graciously regenerates, sanctifies, and saves sinners," unquote. He seems unaware that the election is referring to God's people, Israel, whom he knew before the foundation of the world. Who exactly were the elect? Well, according to James and Peter, in James 1 verse 1 and 1 Peter 1 verse 1, the elect diaspora were descendants of the tribes of Israel who had been dispersed among the nations. Those elect were gathered at the end of the age, according to Matthew 24 verse 31 and 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 1, the complete number of which were sealed before the day of redemption, and we see them in the 144,000 of Revelation 7 verses 3 through 8. The consistent preterist position is that there are no more elect today. If there are any elect today, then the end has not yet come. Based on his Augustinianism-derived belief that all men are born sinners, Mr. Miano needs to have a universal curse of Adam, but as a recent convert to covenant creation, he also believes Adam wasn't the father of all mankind. Perhaps Mr. Miano can tell us how all mankind inherits Adam's curse if all humanity isn't in Adam. Rather, the Bible provides clarity on this issue by clearly defining Adam as the father of Israel, not all mankind. For example, Isaiah 43, verse 27 in the ESV says, "Your first father sinned, and your mediators transgressed against me." Thus far, we've seen Mr. Miano's interpretations are inconsistent, how even the help he has reached out to has hindered his position. His, quote, mystery, unquote, argument has shown to refute his own use of Old Testament passages, and his commitment to doctrines of a 4th century Manichaean Gnostic, Augustine, and 16th century reformer John Calvin require the Bible to be interpreted in a way that imputes all men with sin, when the Bible clearly shows that men are born good, that only Israel had and was under the law, and only Israel was imputed with sin. Excuse me. Now you may recall that the debate is entitled Israel Only, Is It Scripturally Defendable? I was the one who suggested that title, and Mr. Miano unwisely agreed to it. This allowed me to make an overwhelming positive case for IO being scripturally defendable in my opening statement. In that statement, I showed how the entire redemptive narrative pertained only to Israel, that God had a relationship with only one people, his people, Israel, and that atonement, the law, covenants, promises, redemption, forgiveness, adoption, judgment, salvation, and resurrection were all redemptive elements that were only for Old Covenant Israel. Mr. Miano has yet to directly address any of those, so it looks like IO remains unchallenged. Instead, Mr. Miano has chosen to invent some imaginary meta-narrative that he expects people to just take his word for without a shred of actual scriptural exegesis. In my rebuttal, I showed how such a meta-narrative was irrelevant to the debate. It involves reading into Genesis some assumed intention of God for all of humanity to know him and be saved from darkness, which Mr. Miano believes is a lack of knowledge of God. But as I showed before, even if all mankind was in darkness, it does not follow that all mankind needed salvation and redemption. Mr. Miano doesn't seem to understand the Bible's redemptive narrative is not about Jesus coming to save those who didn't know about God. From start to finish, it's about Jesus coming to save and redeem those under the curse of the law. According to Deuteronomy 4 verse 8 and Psalm 147 verses 19 through 20, only Israel had and was under the law. Additionally, man has always had a knowledge of God. His creative work, revealed in the record of nature, shows that God is loving. Man's awareness of and ability to act on objective moral values that can only have their source in a morally good God clearly show that man has always had the ability to know about God and to worship him without reading themselves into Israel's redemptive narrative. As far as knowing God in a personal, relational way, the Bible itself makes it clear that God's relationship with man was limited to one nation, Israel. Amos 3 verse 2 in the New American Standard Bible says, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth." Mr. Miano also said in his rebuttal, quote, "My main response to Mr. Bradley's opening statement is to assert the reading or rereading of my opening statement," unquote. I'm so glad to see this. Mr. Miano was not able to get his imaginary meta-narrative off the ground in either his opening statement or his rebuttal. And in my rebuttals, I have shown how his meta-narrative isn't even relevant to the debate. If his opening statement is all he has to offer as a response to all the scriptures I have provided, showing Israel only is scripturally defendable, then I will thank Mr. Miano for not making a significant challenge to my position in this debate. In his rebuttal, Mr. Miano says, quote, "It seems too clear that the Iowa view creates artificial borders around certain truths, promises, and terms. The Israel-only view also completely fails to understand the theological intentions, extensions, and implications of many biblical truths." Unquote. Mr. Miano seems to think that scriptures which I have used to establish said borders are artificial, and he doesn't get around to naming them specifically. But he wants everyone to believe that his scriptureless commentary about God's intentions, extensions, and implications is true, along with his imaginary meta-narrative involving people outside Israel. It doesn't work that way, Mr. Miano. People need more than just baseless assertions to convince them that a view is true. So, as I said before, until or unless Mr. Miano can take down all the specific, contextually supported scriptures I provided in my opening statement showing IO is scripturally defendable, and then erect his own independent case showing the Bible's redemptive narrative actually included people outside of his people, Israel, I think the evidence will continue to prevail in support of Israel only being scripturally defendable. Thank you.